Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our seminar on theories of regulation. And today we are hosting Professor Paul Hart, and he will talk about take a walk on the bright side. What might we learn about public governance by studying its successes? Usually we study failures, and Paul is studying and focusing on successes. And this is very fascinating project that he will present, and I'm very happy to have him. Let me say a few words about Paul. He's currently professor of public administration at Utrecht University. He came back to Utrecht University after spending 5 years as professor of political science at the prestigious Australian National University. He's also associate dean of the Netherlands School of Public Administration, ANZOC, and is known about research and teaching on crisis management, on public leadership. He's co-authored and co-edited 50 books, including the prize-winning book, The Pivot of Power, Australian Prime Ministers and Political Leadership. Came out in 2017. He has a lot of achievements that can be very easily approached by visiting his webpage and in this Google page. But I would say also on this project that this is a result of ERC project that studying policy success and looking at them at different countries, different sectors, and with many people are involved, including the book series. So thank you very much, Paul, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks very much for inviting me. We only recently got to know each other formally or face to face in Copenhagen, and this opportunity to present was one outcome of that very happy encounter for me. I'm a little bit intimidated to present in this forum because its title is Theories of Regulation. And what I have on offer is neither theories nor necessarily regulation. Do I consider myself a regulation expert? David, however, assured me that this is no problem, that you take a broad view of both what theories are and what regulation is about. So I'm just, bluffing my way through, so to speak. I'm very interested to hear from you. You don't need to wait until I stop talking. Please, we're in a small enough group to be able to, just speak up. Or put stuff in the chat, and then David will direct questions to me or whatever. So I'm very happy to make this as interactive as possible. I've prepared a couple of slides, which, if that's okay with you, I will start sharing. Let's see if we can do this. Yeah, here we go. This project we're now in sort of at the end of the funding period. It was a 5-year funding period, and the funding was indeed by the European Commission, the European Research Council, and they took a chance on a relatively perhaps naive idea about that I offered to them, which was, why do we know so comparatively little about what happens when governments work really well, and so much about why they don't work really well or even very badly. And that's basically all I had to go on, even though I had worked in this area of success and failure for quite some time. Admittedly, much of my time spent on those issues was investigating what one might call the dark side. So my early career was very much in the area of management of crises, blame, fiascos, policy failures, etc. But I felt that the time had come to sort of turn the tables, not just personally, but also institutionally within our field, because I feel that we are perhaps overdoing the dark side a bit, and we're not alone at looking at the dark side. Media and a whole range of other watchdogs tend to look at, apply what I think Jim March once called problematic search to the way they look at governments and how they perform. In other words, good news is no news, and bad news is worth, training the spotlight on. So I felt a need to kind of counterbalance a little bit. I'll be interested to hear whether you agree with my reading of this alleged lack of balance in the way in which fields such as public administration or governance research, etc., approach this subject matter. But it was certainly my sense of an imbalance, and this project is an attempt to kind of bring a bit of balance. Now, I'll take you through the details of it in a moment, but I just wanted to flag in beginning this talk that we have worked now with a whole bunch of scholars, people that were not involved formally in the ERC project at all, but in kind of advertising this message that, hey, isn't it time that we spend a little bit more energy on finding out what works and why it works in various forms and manifestations of governance. And the piece here that was just recently published after many rejections, I should add, many rejections. The piece kind of advocates a program of work which we have labeled kind of positive public administration. And that program, I suppose, is partly inspired by strands of similarly oriented scholarship in other parts of the social sciences, and also in an area that's obviously very relevant to us as well, the whole field of evaluation research. So it's very much about asking the seemingly simple and straightforward question, why do things work? Why, the argument in positive psychology was that there was this, undue attention for psychopathology and very little knowledge at the time about why it is that people, particularly people, operate in very trying circumstances, life circumstances or professional circumstances, function so well and keep functioning so well for long periods of time. I think that was Martin Seligman's core idea. It has given rise to what is now a well-established and productive subfield of psychology. The same goes for organizational studies. Kim Cameron has been the main driver there, and there's been some work on positive evaluation using methodologies such as appreciative inquiry and taking them to the space of evaluation work. So that is, if you like, the broader movement, quote unquote, we hope to set in motion, that there'll be, 10 years from now, there'll be a counterpart to these in the study of governance, regulation, etc. Now, I'm gonna present a couple of tools and a couple of products and a couple of insights from the work we have been doing in my little corner of what hopefully will become a broad church of positive PA. I've worked with a team of about 5 or 6 people at Utrecht, and then a whole network of now dozens of people in a variety of other countries, and Karsten Daubjerg, who's present here today, is one of them. And in the course of these years, we have developed several tools. The first tool I'm sharing with you is our attempt to say, okay, if you want to study cases of what you could call positive deviance, so cases that stand out in a positive sense from a larger population of comparable cases, whether it's, large infrastructure projects or service delivery in youth care or whatever, you need to have a relatively parsimonious way of identifying which cases might actually fit the bill of being an instance of positive deviance in the first place. And this is what we came up with. It's basically the idea of a funnel, where you take a whole bunch of cases that you may consider or have reasons to believe would be candidates for such a case, and you put them through, a series of tests. Not in any kind of formal or let alone quantitative sense, but a kind of, a quick scan kind of test, where on the basis of your available knowledge about that case, does it sort of tick these boxes? The more of these boxes it ticks, or the more ticks per box, if you like, the more reason you would have to include it in a case sample that is deliberately skewed towards the positive. Now, there might be people who have something to say about selecting cases on dependent variables and not having variation on the dependent variable. We'll get to that hopefully later on. But as you can imagine, certainly when starting out with this ambition, you need cases of a success in order to get going. So that's tool number one. And we've sort of used that tool or versions of it in basically three broad streams of work we have started to conduct. One is the study of policy successes. Another one is the study of organizational successes, or what I will later call public institutions. And there's a third stream of work that I will not talk about today, which is about successful collaborative instances of collaborative governance. So I'll talk about the first two. On policy success, basically, the aim was, I think, to, in the first instance, produce works that could counterbalance the books that influenced me heavily when I was going to university, in particularly the book by Peter Hall, Great Planning Disasters, which came out just as I went to university in 1980. And that was sort of, a catalogue of horrors of things that had gone terribly, terribly wrong. Intriguingly, one of the case studies in that book was the construction of the Sydney Opera House. I think today, if you would do a book on great project successes, you could equally include the Sydney Opera House, because once the bloody thing was built, it became, iconic, and revenues, direct and indirect, associated with it far and far exceeded all the costs and all the hoo-ha that occurred during its making. But anyway, I was looking for kind of a flip side of that type of book. And back in 2001, so long before we undertook this, I had a first stab at this working with Mark Bovens, Guy Peters, and a whole range of other people, including people like John Pierre and Jeremy Richardson. We did a book where we took 4 different governance challenges, including regulatory challenges, by the way, and looked at 6 countries' experiences of navigating these challenges. So one was about governing innovation, one was about governing decline, sort of economic decline, governing crisis, etc. And here we didn't select on the dependent variable, we just selected on the input side, major governance challenges using a particular typology that we had developed. And we just we recruited experts to write on these cases. And only at the end of that did we start to then apply this kind of language of, well, is this a case of success and failure, etc.? A lot of them were in between, as you can imagine. But in the course of that work, we came upon this kind of paradoxical situation where what works well is not necessarily well reputed, and vice versa. So we got quite interested in the two asymmetrical boxes here, the hidden failure and the underrated achievement, so to speak. You know, at that time, the complete success to me was not particularly interesting. It seemed like, you know, a reflection of the normal side of things. But it did make me aware, this whole experience, that we needed a, if you like, nuanced and multi-dimensional approach to the understanding of what we choose to call a policy success in the first place. So the definition that is here kind of demonstrate that. So it talks on the one hand, if you like, on the programmatic side, it calls for widely valued social outcomes. On the political side, it mentions things like political legitimacy. And those were basically directly derived from this experience. But as you see, there are other components to this definition. And they were inspired by the work of my good friend and colleague, Alan McConnell, who just recently retired from Sydney University, who added to our little programmatic versus political, he added a third dimension, which was to do with the whole area of the design and management area on patient. So there's a technocratic side to this, you know, is it evidence-based? Is there respect for expertise, etc.? And there is, if you like, a democratic side to process and a procedural justice side to process. And all of that was kind of collapsed in Alan's criteria. For what then became our own kind of assessment tool, evaluation tool, we added a fourth and final dimension here. It's at the bottom of this map here, which is to do with what we have then called endurance. The idea is that one should evaluate success and failure of public policies not as a photo, but as a movie, if you like, or as a series of photos over time. You know, dodging the bullet of the Peters and Waterman mistake, which some of you may recall their famous book In Search of Excellence, you know, about high-performing US companies and what we could learn from them. And some smartass, you know, revisited those same companies 5 years later, and some of them no longer exist and so on. So we felt that, you know, we need to add a temporal dimension to evaluating and identifying policy successes. So this is kind of the more specific map we used, and also, if you like, the instruction we gave to people like Karsten, who wrote a case study for us on organic farming policy in Denmark. And so Karsten and many other colleagues in various sub-projects use this as their kind of basic assessment tool. What has this resulted in? Well, it's resulted in a couple of books so far, and there's 2 more on the way. And our aim was, I must confess, and this is where the trepidation comes in about performing in a seminar on theories. We actually privileged teaching objectives, or if you like, spreading the word and providing materials and ingredients for researchers rather than developing a theory of success. So a lot of our books are heavily driven by case studies. They're like teachable chapter-length case studies, all of which are open access, so as to make them easily usable. So we had a first book out which had a kind of a global feel, and it contains all these cases. So all of these cases have been put through that assessment map that you just saw, which then ends up in kind of nuanced accounts of strengths and weaknesses, or lesser strengths of these cases on those dimensions, plus if you like, a thick description narrative of the policy history and the policy evolution and the outcomes, etc., over time. What these case studies do not contain is well-developed, theory-driven, explanatory accounts. So if you read the case study about Copenhagen's urban planning and its success in underpinning high quality of life in the city, you will not find an account of why this was possible, or why this happened. The reason we did this is precisely because we had these kind of pedagogical objectives. We wanted to keep the accounts kind of relatively open so that teachers and future researchers can, if you like, project their own frameworks, pet theories, hypotheses, etc., on this material. We did a similar book on a regionally focused book on cases of Australia and New Zealand policy successes, some of which may be obscure to you, some of which may be well known. For example, the Australian response to HIV/AIDS in the 80s and early 90s was, world considered to be world leading. Its gun control in Tasmania is still flagged continuously in the US as something that the US should aspire to, and so on and so forth. I will not go into detail, but the formula of this book is exactly the same as of the previous one. What we have done ourselves in terms of, some explanatory work is we've undertaken a QCA, qualitative comparative analysis exercise, looking at variables such as the degree of inclusiveness of policy processes and to what extent that is contributing to both their political success, but also their programmatic success. We also looked at whether there is a policy being basically already in place and only being changed incrementally, or covering terrain that is well understood and well known, if you like, versus a policy that requires major innovations, both technologically or in policy instruments, etc. And what we found was that there are a couple of kind of configurations that emerge from that first QCA exercise on those two bunches of cases that you have just seen. And we found that inclusive design practices overall are a very strong contributor to both programmatic and political and endurance success. We furthermore found that this distinction between, if you like, low and high innovation policies is salient when it comes to the pace and, if you like, the thrust of policy making. Simply put, if you're dealing with a low innovation policy, you can drive it in a more top-down manner at a relatively fast pace and yet be successful. Whereas if really learning and innovation is required, it becomes more and more important to be quite inclusive and to take your time in doing so. Now, these are very preliminary observations. They're nowhere near a theory. Having used QCA a couple of times now, I'm getting more and more skeptical about the methodology itself. I find it very, very constraining, and I find the coding practices very stifling as well. But I'm happy to remain to be persuaded otherwise by some of you who may have other experiences. Now, on successful organizations, we put eggs in the basket of Philip Selznick, his famous book Leadership and Administration, where he makes this distinction between, if you like, a mere organization and an institution. And he has this kind of classic definition, basically an organization that is seen as a good thing for a society to exist. It no longer has to prove itself, at least to some extent. There's a kind of a mythology around it of appropriateness, desirability, etc. And derived from Selznick, but building on Selznick, our central tool in this book, which again was a book of case studies of organizations that we felt met the standard of being counted as institutions. We came up with a version of Selznick's original definition, where we basically were interested in organizations that do well on their core tasks and functions and are recognized for doing well. So if you like, highly reputed on their technical and performative kind of skills in terms of carpenter. But also more dynamically, we were interested in organizations that are able to maintain their core value proposition, their core mission, if you like, if you want to use Selznick's original terminology, maintain that proposition even though times change, political winds change, etc. But also organizations that are able to maintain high levels of public support as times change and as they sometimes have, the inevitable stuff-ups or incidents or indeed scandals. So it was very much about, if you like, these public institutions being good at what Donald Schoen once called dynamic conservatism. Being dynamic on the how in order to be able to conserve the why and what of their performance. And I think this area might be very relevant to take to the study of regulators, for example, and you'll see in a minute that we have a few regulators in our case sample set. The second source of inspiration for this work was the work by Charles Goodsell, who at the very end of a very long career in American public administration came up with this fantastic book on US, mostly federal agencies that were highly reputed, both among the American public and, if you like, in the Beltway in Washington. And he did a kind of an inductive, archival / observational study of them, of their evolution over time. So think about the National Park Service, NASA, the Centers for Disease Control. This was obviously pre-Trump slaughtering it, etc. And from, I think, 7 or 8 case studies in that book, he induced these kind of recurrent qualities in these organizations. And I find these very, very interesting. And some of them are a little bit, perhaps, counter-conventional. I like very much the one at the bottom left. Beliefs are open to contestation and opposition. On the bottom right, agency renewal and learning are ongoing. The reason I single out these 2 particular ones is that they think of what he had observed in his lifetime, because he felt the danger of institutions was of them becoming almost like theologies, providing theologies, over socializing their members, so to speak. Therefore ruling out different views within the organization and therefore stifling it and making them conservative internally and arrogant externally. And that's certainly he also wrote about. Whereas what Goodsell is kind of summing up is a version of empirically observed Selznickian qualities, but added, complemented by these two ones that I just singled out, which have the potential of these organizations becoming more self-correcting, more prone to learning, if you like. And we took these kind of this combined framework to a series of case studies of organizations that we felt, you know, sort of passed through our little funnel, and we could find people interested in writing about and experts on writing about. And I must say I'm very proud of this book, perhaps prouder even than on the other ones, because I think there is so little of this kind of work out there, and the people who wrote in this book, you know, really got stuck into these organizations and give us very, very vivid, critical and reflective accounts of their evolution, their strengths, their governing principles, etc. So I had never heard even of the Indian Electoral Commission, but when you read the story, it provides at least one often overlooked piece in the larger puzzle of why a country that by all accounts should be in perpetual civil war has actually been a functioning democracy for over 70 years. And one of the reasons for that is, you know, this agency and the way it asserted itself, particularly after the dominance of the Congress Party faded and Indian politics became truly competitive, but therefore also very prone to all kinds of forms of electoral fraud. So it's you know, quite a heroic story. I myself had the opportunity to write about CERN, you know, the people who gave us the Higgs boson particle at a price of, you know, I don't know, $1 billion a year or something for the last 70 years or whatever it was. CERN is a fascinating world of an organization which possibly has the most elusive mission of any organization in the history of mankind, which is to discover, you know, the secret to the origins of the universe. And yet, with that kind of broad brush mission, has been able to sustain cross-national funding in a whole bunch of European and later on also other nations. I believe Israel is either a member or an observer of CERN. And producing very little for very, very long periods of time. It's not like NASA, you know, which kind of gives us, you know, rockets to marvel at and then take our checkbooks out. CERN only produces stuff, you know, that captures the public's imagination relatively infrequently, and yet this effort continues and is widely valued, etc., etc. I could go on. I hope you notice my enthusiasm. I'm happy to answer questions about it later on. And by the way, this book too, all the cases here are open access, so have a go. And as you can see, there are some regulators here, right? There is WADA. Did I put WADA on? Yeah, the World Anti-Doping Authority. There is the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission, the Electoral Commission. To some degree, the Singapore Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau could be considered a regulator, although if you look at their practices, it's more like Elliot Ness and the FBI. You know, these people sort of, you know, do raids and are very militaristic, or at least in their first years were very militaristic. And what we find in these organizations is that in a kind of ideal, typical sense, you see kind of virtuous cycles emerging. You know, I was aware there was a very good article by Michael Mazouk in Administrative Science Quarterly in 1992, which actually talked about vicious cycles in organizations, cycles of erosion, decay, etc., and ever more, you know, watchdog activity, ever greater constraining of their autonomy, more vicious internal politics, etc. This is kind of the opposite almost. And I think that the crucial part of this kind of cycle is that these organizations ultimately are given the license to operate and to develop a kind of blame-free culture of continuous learning. Whereas so many other organizations that I have studied in my life are, if you like, stumbling from inquiry to inquiry, or big ticket, imposed reorganization and reorganization, or MOG change, as they call them in Australia, machinery government changes. Whereas the common denominator in many of these organizations is that they actually develop in a much more organic, incremental fashion. None of them is failure-free. They have their scandals. Sometimes they have to bow very deeply. WADA's had its challenges. The BBC's had its challenges, as you are no doubt aware. But the bottom line is the world without them has become unthinkable. And anybody who ever seriously proposes to get rid of them gets punished politically for even proposing this, right? In Britain, it is impossible to abolish the BBC, for example. It's also impossible to propose to abolish the NHS, even though the NHS is by no means the best performing public health system in the world. There is this kind of mission mystique around it. It has an ethos that people seem to like. Now, what did we learn? Again, this is not a theory, but this is more us inducing some common patterns in how these organizations were led in particular. And I'll just let you read through these, but the one I will single out is that is item number 4. I discovered that a lot of these organizations are very good at having the conflicts they need to have. Whether in CERN it was the conflicts between the theoretical physicists and the engineers. The one were the gods, the other one were the lowly workers. But without the lowly workers, the gods could never put their great ideas to the test. But for a long time, there was very awkward and not very productive positioning and tribalism between them. But the learning process inside CERN was one of coming to terms with the reality of these two tribes needing to work together. The same thing applied, for example, in the Amsterdam Concertgebouw Orchestra, which, as in any cultural organization, you've got the tension between the artistic side and, if you like, the commercial side. And for at least 50 years or so in its existence, the artistic side took kind of an unreconstructed precedence. As a result, near bankruptcy all the time, if you like. And it wasn't really until in its governance practices and in its culture, in its DNA, that it allowed to put, if you like, managerial concerns, commercial concerns on an equal footing, that the organization really took off and took itself to another level. And again, number 7, continuous adaptation rather than this stumbling from one formal reorganization or one formal inquiry to another. That is pretty much what I wanted to end up with as a kind of a first introduction. There's a lot more that is coming up, and Karsten's work will be featured in a book on lessons from policy successes in the Nordic region. There's also this project on collaboration that I really didn't talk about, but we built a whole big database of cases of collaborative governance that is searchable and that you can do more correlational or regression work on. So coded cases as well as sort of narrative stories of these cases, all of that's accessible. So if you're interested, by all means, have a look. But I'll stop here and I'm very keen to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Paul. It was a fascinating presentation, very lucid, very clear, and also on important project and public mission. So questions, remarks, depending on how long, and we might collect a few. So who wants to go first?
Happy to
Jonathan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, as you know me, David, I always like to ask questions. Hi, Paul. Thanks for the presentation. So now, of course, you gave a very high-level presentation of quite a lot of research, and it may be that if I had read more of the studies, the answer to this question would be evident. But so you talked about, let's say, I would say, two dimensions of successful public organizations. One would be their attributes and characteristics, let's say, where, I mean, to some extent, what might be called culture figures quite prominently. And then towards the end, you talked about practices, which were linked to the culture, but were more active. They used active verbs at any rate in them, but they were still at a very high level of abstraction. So, it would not necessarily, there might be many ways of achieving those different or pursuing those different active verbs. And so my question for you is really whether you get down to what I would call, the next level of granularity, and particularly looking at, the organizational mechanisms and really specific practices that these organizations use to achieve these goals, and how they're reproduced over time, because you also suggest that some of these organizations maintain these characteristics over even generations. And we would always want to know, beyond, let's say, principles to which people say they are committed or are obliged to demonstrate actually works. And let me just give you an example, and maybe I will, if afterwards I'll send you the paper. You can see what you think. So actually, ironically, some colleagues and I have been studying the municipality of Utrecht, which we consider to be actually a fantastic success story in decentralization of social care, and especially youth care in the Netherlands. But in trying to explain, why we think that and how we think it got there, and how it differs from other municipalities in the Netherlands, which have struggled much more with these tasks. I mean, we really tried to identify some very specific mechanisms and practices, and we say that the master innovation that they have, multidisciplinary review of stock cases to identify, where the problems are, both at the level of frontline practice, but also the more systemic problems and rules and organizational routines that may need to be changed. And they keep iterating this, and then they develop pilot programs to solve some of the problems, and they evaluate them in the same way, and then they roll them out, and then they, keep iterating this. And that, they also say that they believe in a set of leading principles, which you could probably recognize, in relation to some of the kinds of things that you talked about. But for us, what's important is not only that they have these principles, but that they actualize them in these organizational mechanisms and practices which seem to lead to results. And I'm wondering whether you are able to get down to that level in the cases that you study, whether you think it's important to do so,
Yeah.
whether you can give examples of different kinds of mechanisms that might travel across different types of organizations, like the one I just described.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for your question, Jonathan. And I'm delighted to hear you're studying Utrecht and youth care. It so happens that one wall away from where I'm sitting now is the woman who's just been appointed to reorganize youth care in the Netherlands because it's bleeding money. This is my wife, and she spends 90-hour working weeks on it right now. But Utrecht is always and rightly cited as an example of good practice. So the short answer to your question is yes. I believe narrative context, preferably, is like a meta, is highly comparable in terms of the problem they're addressing, the broader institutional governance context, which is sort of, if you like, the Nordic configuration of parliamentary democracy, often minority governments, and so on and so forth. So you can control a lot, and then you can start digging deeper in what would then explain certain observed variations in programmatic success, or let's say political success of highly comparable policies. So I believe very strongly in doing that. We just haven't done it yet. I've had one kind of go at this kind of QCA, if you like, a secondary analysis based on the narrative case studies we had produced. As you picked up, I feel it's a little bit of a kind of a garbage in, garbage out approach. You can only test for a couple of variables that you have decided ahead of time are worth studying, and what are your reasons for singling out those variables. If you have good reasons, i.e. theory driven, or research elsewhere has suggested that in cases of this kind, then I'm all for it. But we were naive in which examples that you mentioned. Yes, I believe that so what you have identified is a certain practice that you singled out, which at a certain point in time in youth care, particularly in the context of implementing a decentralized system, proved to be very useful. As you will have gathered, the cases that are featured in the Guardians of Public Value book have a very different kind of time horizon, and there the driving puzzle is not why was this organization good at something at this particular critical juncture in its existence, but why does it did it remain a high-performing, highly reputed entity over time? So more like Carpenter's question in a way than the kind of question you have. That said, certainly my next one of my next ambitions is to then go back to these types of organizations, such as the ones featured in the book, and to zero in on critical episodes, periods of great innovation, or when they were really confronted with a challenge, could be an acute budgetary challenge or an incident, etc., and to start examining how they overcame these challenges. And I think that will probably start to point me towards the kinds of more micro and meso level mechanisms or practices, as you call them, that enable these organizations to do so. Now, whether we are able to then find patterns across a set of cases that are so different from, such as the ones that I have, is highly doubtful. Maybe each case has its own story to tell when you drill down to that more micro level, and the commonalities only come out when you zoom, or you move up to that more, level of overarching principles at which we have currently conducted our work.
Yeah.
But I'm very interested in reading your paper, Jonathan, and if you will allow me, I'll pass it on to my wife as well. Who knows, it may help reform Dutch youth care policy once again.
Absolutely. I will send it to you as soon as we get off this call.
Thanks.
Yeah. I see Ruth is wants to ask, so please, Ruth.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk, and I must look into some of the case studies. I'd be really interested too. I had a couple of questions. One was about the temporal aspect of successes of chess waiting lists. It can still be a success if they come down, even if they go up again later because of, well, maybe a pandemic or a change of government or something like that. And I wondered what sort of timescale one would expect such a success to be over. And my other question was on the public satisfaction about an organization. And I think that's really important. But I also feel that having a majority of people satisfied doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't stuff going on that gets ignored under the surface. For instance, how an organization deals with whistleblowers or serious complaints. They might say, well, we have only had one complaint. Does it matter? So, because I'm interested in seeing how organizations can overcome complacency in that way.
And you'll find some clues to that question, and I hope I helped you by pointing out the good cell framework and the components in there that help overcome that complacency. I think you are right, and Alan McConnell in more recent work on policy successes started asking this uncomfortable question, success for whom? And drawing attention to, if you like, soft voices in the policy conversation, forgotten groups, and so on. Distributional issues, if you like, very classical political science stuff, but in a new guise. And I think we need equivalents for that in the study of, organizational reputation, legitimacy, etc. We need to have if you like, a differentiated approach that privileges or that is attuned to picking up on any of these kind of soft. Indeed, in the Netherlands, the entire political landscape is completely dominated at the moment, or has been for the last I'd say 6 or so months, or perhaps even going on a year, of the tax office kind of administering a particular were not strong enough to make the organization reconsider, aid, inappropriately, etc. And I've gotten very interested. I don't know whether you have experience of that, but see more and more stuff coming out on organizational listening as a kind of a quality. And it reminded me of some of the work by Edgar Schein. Remember Edgar Schein? He started to write these more reflective kind of popular books. One he did that resonated with me was called The Gentle Art of Humble Inquiry, and humble inquiry as a kind of a counter complacency mechanism. But also, something that requires not just an attitude or an understanding of role and professionalism at the level of an individual, but also as humility as kind of a quality of an organization that can be, nurtured and needs to be protected. And it can be very hard being humble when you're CERN, or when you're the BBC, or when you're a government monopolist, and 70% or 75% of the public says it likes you. It's very tempting not to pay attention to the rest of them. So I very much hear what you're saying. I think it's a really relevant issue. No, let me stop there. I could go on, but time is running away from us, I think. Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you, Ruth, as well. Paul, the last question is coming from me, would be kind of, if you would write the proposal now, start the project again, would you give more place to explanatory theory in the project, or let me ask you this way: if I want to kind of develop a theory of policy successes, where should I go? Which kind of direction? Which are new? Okay, experimentalism is one way to go. Leadership is another way to go. How should we really approach our successes? And I agree there are many successes. Using different language, different perspective, if at all.
I only heard the first part of your question, which was if you were to rewrite your proposal, would you go for a more upfront explanatory approach, and where would you, where in this enormous literature, etc., would you locate yourself? That's how I understand the question. Is that correct?
That's correct. Absolutely.
Yeah. Before answering that, let me just in 30 seconds also give an answer to Maya's question, which popped up in the chat. Maya, in this work that I didn't present about on collaborative governance and its, if you like, successes, the factor that you single out turns out to be extremely powerful. This is very well documented in meta studies, but it's also an outcome of the work that we do. So in other words, interpersonal trust as the basis for interagency trust, which then becomes, a key driver or sustainer of collaborative efforts, particularly when you're tackling things like wicked problems that transcend, institutional mandates and boundaries, etc. So I think you're absolutely on the mark with this. And if you have a look at our collaborative governance database and the various publications that came out of that, you will see a strong emphasis on this. Now back to your question, David. Look, there's a kind of a historical biographical element to the choices I made not to go explanatory, which is that I really badly burned myself going explanatory when I was still studying policy failures. I don't recall whether I told you the story when we met in Copenhagen, David, but Mark Bovens and I had developed a very, in our eyes, very sophisticated multi-level explanatory theory of what we then called policy disasters. The kind of thing that Chris Hood could have built, 3 levels, 3 it was like, one of those nice deductions. And we using that theory, applying it to cases and so on. The other one was Ern Wildavsky, and both in their inimical ways sort of proceeded to completely demolish in a, exemplary collegiate kind of spirit. So they both in their own ways kind of pointed us towards first figuring out how do we know a policy failure when we see one? And so we ended up writing a very social constructivist book about, perceptions and reputations and all that kind of stuff. So that was the DNA with which I then approached 20 years later this self-imposed task of studying policy success. So I was just scared away from even contemplating explanatory work, but also you know, having spent the intermittent years studying leadership a lot, I was also acutely aware of the fallacy of going for heroic, agent-centric, naive agent-centric accounts of policy success or governance success, of the variety that we see so often in popular business books, etc. So in the end, I decided to go agnostic. Now, as to the second part of your question, with today's knowledge, where would you look at? I would definitely look at things like institutional design, you know, the design of checks and balances, the design of, if you like, the rhythm and nature of accountability arrangements that impinge upon organizations. The design of spaces to have conflicts in a manner that is safe and professional. And I would very much probably go for the more soft elements of organizing, you know, cultural practices, cultural norms, and the way they can be influenced, the extent to which they can be influenced by forms of shared leadership, for example. Those would probably be things I would be looking at. But I'm also a political scientist enough to realize that probably a third area that I would really look at is, to what extent can you have your ass covered for a project? So in other words, the managing up of political principles that need to give you the time and the space to experiment before chopping your head off prior to you having any chance of, you know, developing results, so to speak. So there is a political piece to this that I haven't really emphasized very much in my talk today, but that I think would be very important as an explanatory factor.
Yeah, this is wonderful and very suggestive answer. I'm very grateful for it. I'm also appreciate very much the opportunity to learn more from you. And I hope this is not the last time. So I would like to thank you for a fascinating lecture and impressive work, academic work all the way. And I hope to host you again, maybe this seminar or face-to-face in Israel. I hope,
thanks very much, David. It was my pleasure. And thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you very much, Paul.